Hi, my name is Lavanya Tijan. I'm a pediatric hospitalist and clinical informatician at CHOP and a data scientist here at PedsNet. And I'm going to give your week 5 lecture about standardized vocabularies and Atlas. So learning points are that we are going to discuss vocabularies used in PedsNet CDM, key differences between ICD and SNOMED, how to use Atlas, and strategies for code set development. So why standardized vocabularies? So PedsNet member sites may have different source EHRs that may use different vocabularies. Querying likely would require different database languages and methods. As PedsNet gets bigger, this would become very unwieldy. Transformation of source EHR data to a standardized vocabulary allows for standardization of querying, definitions, and results. This will allow easier and more rapid data exchange, query development, and data analysis. These are some images from the Odyssey website that shows that you could have different source EHR systems that are transformed to the common data model, then arranging the data into similar patterns. And then your analysis method could be used across all the transformed data at once and generate results that you could use and not have to worry about making adjustments for the vocabularies or other definitions or conventions after you have the data. To the right is just an overview of the common data model showing how things are organized into things like the person table, drug exposure, procedure occurrence, measurement, etc. So we ended up picking the OMOP data model because it met most of the needs that we were looking for. But we also knew that we could modify it slightly to address pediatric specific needs that we knew would be important for PedsNet. So some common pediatric concepts of domains not in all terminologies are things like gestational age, something that we added to the person table, immunizations, which typically are greater interest in pediatrics than in adult medicine, and making sure that more pediatric specific measurements such as head circumference could be accounted for in our measurements. We also knew that we wanted to make sure we used vocabularies that would be able to accommodate things like newer genetic diagnoses that are not in ICD terminology. ICD-9, ICD-10 have catch-all codes that are kind of like other genetic diagnoses that are not as descriptive. What we use and we're going to discuss for diagnoses has more granularity, more specific codes available for many of the genetic diagnoses, though more and more keep coming out. So just some basics of how concepts, some of the terms we use in the OMOP CDM. So a concept is the semantic notion of each event, basically any medical idea. Could be a diagnosis, a medication, a procedure, you name it. Concept codes are the alphanumeric string representing the concept in its source vocabulary. So these are not necessarily unique because the same alphanumeric string could be used in other vocabularies. So you need to specify the vocabulary ID. Concept name is a name for the concept from the source vocabulary itself. Now, concept ID is what we like to use when we query. It is the concept, it is the integer ID for each concept. It is the primary key. So no two concepts have the same concept ID. And when we do queries, we use the concept ID. When we generate a code set, we will then search on those concept IDs. And there are other columns. The last one I'll touch base about is this one called the standard concept you'll see. So S signifies that this is one concept is designated standard for this particular medical idea. Null would be that there is no value, basically no value if it is not the standard. When I generate code sets, I do not restrict to the standard concept alone because sometimes we do a minority of our mapped concept IDs in the PedsNet databases are non-standard. So, but it's just I wanted to make sure you guys were aware what standard meant. So on the right is an example of what this could look like. So if we took the idea of streptococcal pneumonia, a pneumonia that's due to the streptococcal bacterium. This has a concept code of J13 in the ICD-10 CM, so ICD-10 clinical modification vocabulary. In that vocabulary, it is called pneumonia due to Streptococcus pneumoniae. It has a concept ID of 3520798, and that is the one that we would use when we were doing querying on the condition occurrence table, if this was of interest. And the standard concept is null. Actually, sorry, I'll take one step back. That concept ID is specific to this ICD-10-CM. We would actually have to change this into the appropriate SNOMED code that relates to this concept ID, and we're going to talk about it in a second. So that we have to map the ICD-10 concept ID to the SNOMED concept ID that's appropriate, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So, diagnosis. I'm going to go through a couple of different main vocabularies that we deal with in the context of somebody comes to you requesting to do a study about pediatric pneumonia. So when you're starting with the diagnoses here, so pediatric pneumonia, researchers are in the habit of knowing ICD-9 codes, ICD-10 codes for the diagnosis of interest typically. That they're studying. They may have this from other papers or from source papers. And the ICD-9 or ICD-10 distinction matters how far back in time they're going. So ICD-10 only became required after fall of 2015. So if you have a study that's going further back than 2015 and for whatever reason needed to look in EHR data, you might need the ICD-9 codes there. However, in PedsNet, we standardize all conditions to the SNOMED CT terminology. How we get there is that each of the EHR sites, they map their local diagnosis data, preferentially from IMO, Intelligent Medical Object codes, or from ICD to SNOMED. And OMOP maintains constant mappings for that ICD to SNOMED step. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So ICD versus SNOMED codes. These are probably the ones that people have heard the most about. So just to get a little into the technical details of what these things are, ICD is a classification system. It arranges like-related entities, in this case, diagnosis data, or some procedure codes as well. And it's intended for classification of clinical conditions and procedures to support statistical data analysis across healthcare systems. It's very good for reporting. At the same time, this is useful because it can provide standards for comparison of health statistics at national and international levels. So that's ICD, like I said, focused on diseases, also some procedure codes. That is in contrast to a terminology like SNOMED. And here, a terminology is defined as something that, in medicine, a set of concepts and relationships that provide a common reference point for comparisons and aggregation of data about the entire healthcare process, recorded by multiple different individuals, systems, or institutions. So this actually can be, you can have terminology specific to certain domains in medicine. SNOMED, or the systematized nomenclature of medicine clinical terms, it covers diseases, clinical findings, etiologies, procedures, health outcomes. It is very, very specific. There are hundreds of thousands of codes in it, and many, many relationships between those codes, because SNOMED has ontological properties because of logic-based approach to some relationships between terms. So it's not just a organization of terms, they are related, and we'll show some of this in the live demo on Friday, how things are organized in SNOMED. Basically, maybe it's because it is conditions that are caused by similar bacteria, conditions that affect the same part of the body, etc. ICD, not as specific as SNOMED, as you'll see in the next slides. And that is actually useful when you're trying to do reporting, because you want to be able to roll things up into bigger categories. And that is something that, and since ICD is, like I said, used for comparing statistics across countries, within countries, organizations, that is useful there. So just to illustrate this, we're going to compare some ICDs for pneumonia. So ICD-9 CM. So CM is a US modification of the ICD codes. So ICD-9 CM has 59 codes for pneumonia, 42 without influenza-related pneumonias. ICD-10 CM has 86 codes for pneumonia, 37 without codes for influenza. These ICD9data.com, ICD10data.com are useful websites for looking at them. They also have, if you have an ICD-9 code, you want to see the ICD-10 code and vice versa, they do have options when you look up one type of code to say convert to the other one to see this. It also has stuff on procedures, which we'll talk about later. SNOMED, then this is from the SNOMED CT browser website. For the concept of pneumonia, this terminology has 248 codes, 239 without influenza. So much more descriptive in its organization and types of pneumonia than in ICD alone. And that's one of the reasons why we like SNOMED for PEDSNet, because we can get to much more specificity with our diagnoses, much more granular diagnoses, or I should say conditions, since we talk about conditions in PEDSNet. IMO, or intelligent medical objects, I briefly mentioned. This is a proprietary terminology that maps diagnostic and procedural terminologies to medical concepts and billing codes. It's used in most EHRs because it's very user-friendly and allows very accurate data entry. And then on the back end, it maps those user-friendly terms to the terminologies that are needed for billing, like ICD codes or CPT codes, et cetera. For instance, this is not a pneumonia example, but in the era of COVID, we're very interested in MIS, the multi-system inflammatory syndrome. 21 different IMO terms map to the single ICD-10 CM code of M35.81. These are just examples here. So OMOP does not use IMO directly because, like I said, it's proprietary. They don't have licensing fees for that. So instead, we use SNOMED, which does not have the same requirements, and it's not privately held like IMO is. Okay, so talk a little bit about how you may be getting ICD-9 codes, ICD-10 codes from the requester. And so you need to figure out how you can get to the actual SNOMED codes that are equivalent to it. So there are some different ways of doing this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in R and SQL you can do this. There is a table provided by Odyssey called Concept Relationship. It provides translations from non-standard to standard concepts. You can use this for diagnoses. You can use this for medications, maybe not so much for labs and procedures. And it's indexed by a composite primary key of the concept ID 1 and 2. And you use this with either a maps to or a maps from relationship ID, which you'll see on the next slide. And this is a crosswalk between equivalent concepts, non-standard to standard. Please note that some mappings may connect a source concept to more than one standard concept. For example, and this is taken from the text of the Odyssey book, the ICD-9 code for hepatitis E with hepatic coma is mapped to both SNOMED codes for acute hepatitis E as well as the SNOMED code for hepatic coma, since they are two different clinical concepts, even though they're all in a single one there with ICD-9 CM. So this is to illustrate back to that pneumonia example. So taking that pneumonia due to Streptococcus pneumoniae, that J13 concept code has a concept ID here, which maps to this concept ID 1, or the same one here. And then we can say this concept ID 1, which we know is that ICD-10 code, it will map to a SNOMED code, which has an ID of 258785. You go look here in the concept table. And you'll see that that maps to this concept code, which is for pneumococcal pneumonia, a condition in the SNOMED vocabulary. All right. And then concept ancestor is another useful table, again, for medications and conditions more than anything else, really for things that are well organized in hierarchies. And it basically relates a higher level ancestor concept ID to a lower level, more specific descendant concept ID. So another approach you can take is that you could look for descendants of pneumonia, which has a concept code here, to find the lower level concept IDs for other pneumonia condition codes. So if we know that concept code in SNOMED for pneumonia, which we could have gotten from the SNOMED CT browser, has this concept ID here, we know that we can go to the concept ancestor table and say, okay, if I give you this concept ancestor concept ID, I can then do a query where I take all the descendant concept IDs. And so that pneumococcal pneumonia is a concept ID descendant of that ancestor concept ID. So you can go from that very general term pneumonia into one of these more specific granular terms in SNOMED using the concept ancestor table. The levels of separation are talking about how many steps it had to go through to get from one type of pneumonia to the other, in this case, or from one diagnosis to another, from one med to another. So medications. Medications, maybe the request in keeping with the study would be antibiotics for bacterial pneumonia. If you're lucky, the investigator might have a list of generic names of interest, but you would actually need to pull codes to do the queries in PedsNet. The PedsNet standard is to look for the concept IDs associated with RxNorm and RxNorm extension vocabularies. That said, there are you may get codes, the provider may give you RxNorm codes if they give you any. There are things like GPI, Multum. You can try using that with the concept relationship table. There are sometimes challenges with medications where things like drugs like TPN or chemo, they often may have unique codes at each site, so it may not be as obvious how to query for them. But just another way, excuse me, it's just something that you may have to look at in the data. But I think for most of the challenges with meds, RxNorm extension, because RxNorm is required for billing within source EHRs, will be useful for querying meds. So one site that I like to use, because sometimes you need, they may just give you like the list of generic names of some, maybe not all the drugs they're interested in. And so a useful website is this thing called RxNav. And if you search on the name of the drug here, amoxicillin, a very common drug used for the treatment of pneumonia, you can then look at the class of these drugs, and I'll demonstrate this live on Friday, that you could say, okay, amoxicillin is a type of penicillin with extended spectrum, related to other penicillins, related to antibacterials for systemic use, and you can keep going up to higher and higher levels. And then sometimes what you may need to do is actually go to one of these classes, see all the antibiotics associated, and say, hey, to the investigator, which of these antibiotics would you like me to pull codes about? Pulling codes, what I mean by that is that in RxNorm, there are different term types. You can go from the least specific of an ingredient, such as amoxicillin, and then you can go to all of these more higher specificity terms. So you'll go to things that are, branded components, clinical drug form, SCDF, which could be amoxicillin oral liquid product, so a formulation of amoxicillin, and then all the way to the most specific, like the branded pack. So here, amoxidrop 50 milligram per ml oral suspension. Usually, our requesters do not ask us for, to restrict to these specific branded packs, but they may say, I only want to know about oral medication. So you may be asked to only look at the antibiotics that are liquids, pills, non-IV, etc. Like I said, you can take the concept ancestor table to go from less to more specific drug codes. So if you know the amoxicillin ingredient, you could use that and grab all the descendants there. I often will also use some string matching on the generic name. It will not necessarily get you the brands names when you're doing that kind of querying, but it will get you all of the, help you get all of the codes that, just in case, like there might be, that have the word, like the key word here, amoxicillin in them. So that's medications. Labs. So labs in this type of study about pediatric pneumonia could be very vague. It could be, okay, you know, why don't you give me all the blood cultures and viral testing? Very generic. You may want to ask some questions. What do you mean by viral testing? Testing in the blood, testing from respiratory specimens, COVID, etc. Researchers are typically not going to have codes for you. They may have lab names. The PedsNet standard for lab codes is that in our common data model, we want to everything in this LOINC, logical observation identifiers, names, and codes. So other possibilities might be CPT codes, SNOMED, again, because SNOMED covers many, many domains, EUCOM, etc. But really, LOINC is what we want our labs in. Challenges we might have are if there are some very site-specific lab codes results that they don't have in the map to LOINC codes. Not usually a big problem with the more common labs. This could involve things with genetic testing, or if their lab does its own test for certain things. Not all codes may be used at each site. An example is fasting glucose. So that's sometimes of interest in diabetes studies, but we have looked at across the sites in PedsNet, and sometimes some sites have better data on fasting glucose than others. Some places they don't put it in they call it a glucose test, but they just run it at a certain time. Not that you can necessarily trust the time as a fasting, but they have some other comment that calls it fasting rather than the name itself. And you know, sometimes when we're looking at labs, we do quality checks. If things don't look right, the numbers look strange, you want to make sure that maybe the source and the lab code match. So there is a specimen source column in the measurement lab table, and maybe you were expecting it to be a serum or blood, but for some reason their source is using urine. And so that's something that would be a quality issue that you would want to avoid. Like I said, there's not always consistent hierarchical organization here for labs, so it's challenging to come up with the list of labs. One place you could look is you can go to the LOINC website, create a free account, and you can search for the codes of interest. We will demonstrate how you can do this in Atlas, and also from the concept table, you could string search on the terms like blood and culture in the vocabulary ID of LOINC and take all the codes that way. Procedures. Procedures are probably the most challenging of all the codes that we have to generate. And again, you're not likely to get a lot of help from the investigator. They might say, oh, I want to know about all the chest x-rays. And in PedsNet, for imaging studies, we won't have the results, but we would be able to tell you if they were actually done. Did they have chest imaging done? Not that the result was positive, negative, etc. So, but you may also want to say, are we stopping at chest x-rays? Are we interested in CTs, MRIs, ultrasounds? So PedsNet does not have one single, our data model does not rely on a single standard procedure code. The most common thing you're going to see are CPT codes, or you could see ICD procedure codes like ICD-9-PROC or ICD-10-PCS, HCPCS, or again, SNOMED. Challenges, there could be a time sensitivity here. In the fall of 2015, just like we saw with diagnosis codes requiring ICD-10, you hear, which wasn't such a big deal with diagnoses since everything gets mapped to SNOMED, here you might need to look at ICD-10 procedure codes because of CMS requirement. Location sensitive, CPT is widely used outpatient and inpatient. ICD-10 procedure codes, again, required for inpatient procedures and surgeries after fall of 2015. And there's not always a great hierarchy for you to rely on here to be able to look for like ancestors or mappings. Finding procedure codes, there aren't good free crosswalks between procedure terminologies or from Odyssey. What I will typically do is string search the concept table, limiting to the vocabularies for CPT, ICD-9-PROC, ICD-10-PCS, HCPCS, and SNOMED. You might also, I will often look at web searches for online biller coding websites. Literally Google common MRI procedure codes will give you tons of websites that show these billing codes for, often this is a great way to get CPT codes. You could use this website Codify here, which allows you to get at least some high level codes through a search engine, or ICD9data.com, ICD10data.com. They do have ICD9-PROC and ICD10-PCS codes, but CPT codes are by far the most common ones we encounter in the procedures that we get. Okay. So a tool that we're going to go over and I'll demonstrate live and will be really helpful for you in the exercises is this tool called Atlas that comes from Odyssey. It's a web-based tool that allows you to execute analyses on standardized patient-level observational data. The things you may want to play around with when you have access, vocabulary search. It will search the vocabulary and show you how frequently the code, which is the record count, RC, and the code descendants, the descendant record count, or DRC, appear in your database. So this is great if you're trying to see, like, you have a code in mind, how often does it appear? Or concept sets, you can actually use the concept set feature in Atlas to generate the code sets that can be saved for future queries or downloaded as a CSV so that you can use that with your R code or SQL code. And then cohort definitions. You can construct a cohort based on one or more criteria and time constraint. And this could be useful as a way outside of R or SQL to do quick feasibility estimates. You could say, I want patients with, in this time frame, age, who have, diagnoses, pediatric pneumonia diagnoses based on a code set, a concept set that you developed using the Atlas tool. Here's the Atlas tool itself. On Friday, when we do this, we're going to go live. We will do a live demonstration about how you can do that, searching the vocabulary, generating concept sets. For the exercises, you definitely could try to use this to generate the code sets of interest if you would rather do this than doing it in R or SQL. And then during, like I said, we'll use Atlas in real time to show you what these code sets look like. And definitely review the Atlas tutorials, especially the ones about concept sets. There's one about ACE inhibitors and one about looking at diagnoses. They're very useful. They will explain Atlas much better than I do. And they are very helpful for doing the exercises. So just some last things that I would say when you're developing code sets for PEDS-NET studies, request as much information as you can upfront from the PI, or expect this to be iterative. You may have to have a back and forth with them. When you're talking conditions, take any ICD codes provided from them and map them to the SNOMED code via the concept relationship. Please note that for ICD-10 codes, the concept table has both ICD-10 and ICD-10-CM. Again, the CM is the US modification of it that's used by CMS. I would search both of them because each of them will have different concept IDs. And then you can map them to the SNOMED codes, but in theory, they should hopefully map to similar, if not the same SNOMED codes. And sometimes I would even check, if the numbers don't look right, if you're not seeing as many as you would expect, you might want to check the source values for older, more rare diagnoses, or to see what ICD codes are mapping to SNOMED codes. And you could use the SNOMED CT browser. Again, find a SNOMED ancestor concept and take all the descendants. Ask the PI to then review this for inclusion, exclusion. And they can tell you keep these codes, reject those codes, etc. For drugs, use RxNAV to identify related medication ingredients for possible inclusion, take descendants of the ingredients. You might want to say to your investigator, here are all the ingredients. What do you think? Note that if you start with an ingredient and you take descendants, you may hit combination medications. So this comes up a lot with like antihypertensive medications. So these meds may contain like a diuretic, an ACE inhibitor, or an ARB. So you may want to talk to the investigator. How do they want to handle combination meds? How are you going to filter out those? So that's just one thing to be aware of in case they say, I don't want combination meds. You might want to look at the clinical drug forms and instead of starting just from the ingredient, like we talked about earlier. Labs, I would do string matching on lab names. Like CBC, BMP, you might want to have to take that acronym and say complete blood cell count, basic metabolic panel, etc. The LOINC site could be useful here. Using Atlas always could be useful for these things. And then procedures, string match. If you have to prioritize, focus on CPT codes, then consider ICD-10-PDS or ICD-9-PROC, HCPCS, etc. others. And then biller and coding websites are really useful. And I will say sometimes, like if I'm just having a hard time figuring out what procedure codes are of interest, you could try identifying your cohort and then look at the frequency of procedures associated with those patients or with those diagnoses. And then you could maybe provide that to the investigator and say, hey, which of these procedures of interest would you like me to include? You might want to take a first pass through them because it will have every procedure associated with that for that patient. But those are just some high-level review of code set development. And just one other thing, there is this thing called the Value Set Authority Center. And this is another way where people who have spent making code sets can take a lot of time. And we will have our own ways of sharing code sets that we've generated here at the DCC. But this is another way that you can go and actually try to search for things like antibiotics that could be specific to certain diagnoses like pharyngitis, otitis media, et cetera. And it'll tell you like who developed them, what is the code system, et cetera. And if it's a med in RxNorm, that could be useful for you. And just another way of finding code sets that could be useful. And often these are really high quality. They've been validated by the groups who have put them out there, the data stewards. And I think Charlie Bailey has actually contributed at least one, if not more, for like otitis media here. All right, here's my information, Lavanya Tejan, and my email if you have any questions. And looking forward to going over this with you guys on Friday.